Litt fortere? Nei, nei.
Canteo.
¿Qué no la poquito entonces?
Ay, caramba. Vamos.
Tusen tack.
Gracias. Carlos Aranjuez, Carmen Lapis. Get us in the mood to transport you to another place. And we'll hear more about that as we go on. 2 minutes off the start. Let me just clean my glasses. Because I'm going to need them. Great.
You want to sitting here while you talk?
That would be great, actually, if you guys can come up. Mariel, Bjørn, Andrei. It then frees up space for if any last-minute people coming in the door as well. So that can be a good thing. Mike, welcome. Skål, yeah. If you don't have a drink in your hand already, maybe you want to go and get one. You're going to need it. Hi, welcome. Yep, we hit the hour. So welcome, all of you. Thanks for coming to this, the book launch of my book, Sovereign Forces, Everyday Challenges to Environmental Governance in Latin America. So it's a pleasure to have a live audience, albeit one which is perhaps more limited than I'd hoped for or we might want. There are still, of course, corona regulations in place. But to help us a little bit, at least we also have this event being streamed. So be aware of that, all of those that are in the room. This event is also being streamed on YouTube as well. As far as I understand, the cameras are facing this way, so you shouldn't be on camera, but just be aware of that, okay? And if anyone has a problem with that, well, there's the door. So before we get going, let me just say that this is certainly not an everyday occurrence for me, right? Although we're talking about everyday challenges, this is not an everyday occurrence for me. Now, in my academic career, I've published academic articles and other books, but this is the first time that I'm presenting something that only has my name and no other author on the front cover. This monograph is a first for me. I should hasten to clarify, however, that although it is only my name on the front cover, as the acknowledgements in the book make clear, many other individuals and some institutions are also responsible for my being able to actually conclude this work. So as I've mentioned in the acknowledgements to the book, these contributions to my support and ability to find time to work really mean that Sovereign Forces has many, many authors. Although I'm the author, I couldn't have done this without also their assistance in my authorship. I especially, of course, need to thank the Latin American communities that I write about here, and very much this book is really for them. My multiple friends and colleagues, some of which are here as well, present in the room today. And of course, my family. Without you, there would, of course, be no peace of mind to write anything at all. The important contributions of my colleagues continue this evening. I need to introduce you to three people here up on the stage who've been brave and patient enough to actually read the book. I mean, come on, they've read it. And engaged enough even to turn up and actually discuss it with me as well. So, honor to you guys for taking that time. I would also like to add that you're people who I respect for your academic work and who I think are actually quite interesting to listen to, right? That's kind of important as well when they're up on the stage, that they're actually quite interesting to listen to as well. So the only payment they've actually received, it's a very poor payment, or maybe not, is a copy of the book. So Bjørn Bertelsen, who's here in the middle, who's Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen and the Executive Director of the Global Research Program on Inequality, otherwise known as GRIP. We have Mariel Aguilar Stølen, who used to be not only a friend and neighbor, but is also currently Professor of Human Geography at the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo. And last but not least, we have Andrei Marin, who's my colleague at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. He's an associate professor at our department, and someone who I've had a lot of contact with over this pandemic year. We're one of the couple of people who've hung out in the office, managed to get exemptions to be actually allowed to stay and work in office. So we've had a lot of contact over this last year. I should also lastly mention, in terms of an acknowledgement, really the sponsor, that is those that are paying for this actual event happening, and that's actually a research cluster that I also am connected to, the Rights and Power and Development Cluster at our university, the Norwegian University of Life Science, and a grant that we also hold as well from the Norwegian Research Council. Andrei is actually the leader of this research cluster, and maybe it's right as well that, Andrei, you should just have a quick word on behalf of the cluster. Doesn't have to be long.
Do I have to use the mic? Yes. Yeah.
The technician wants it.
So, okay. Yeah, this cluster of ours is one of four at Noragrik, the Department for International Environment and Development Studies. And we recently received a grant from the Research Council of Norway to strengthen our cluster in terms of more contacts with, especially with northern partners for once. and also to maybe direct our work in a certain direction that has a lot to do with studying rights and transformations, green transformations, not the least. So your book, Bjørn, is dead in the middle of this, so it makes perfect sense.
Thanks very much. Great. So now with the introductions and acknowledgements out of the way, let's get going with the book launch. So what I propose to do actually is the following. I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm going to read 3 short parts of the book just to give you a little idea of how it's written and what it's about. And then after that, once I've ended reading, I'm going to open it up for a conversation with my illustrious colleagues, Bjørn, Mariel, and Andrei. And I'll start actually with Bjørn in the middle. He's traveled the farthest over from Bergen, so for that reason, we'll go with Bjørn, and then we'll go to Mariel, and then we'll go to Andrei. Andrei's too local, so he just has to accept the last role there. So where I welcome you basically to voice your comments about the book and ask some questions as well, right? Now, for those of you who are not from an academic background, I would apologize beforehand if there are words and concepts that you might not be familiar with and may need a little bit more of perhaps explanation. That might be something that comes up, but we can address this in questions as we go. I've also invited my colleagues to discuss the book, so I'm not actually looking for hygge. I'm not actually looking for, just everything to be nice and cozy. There's also a possibility here as well for critical comment as well in both their questions and comments. So at the end of this grilling, we will also open the floor to questions from you guys in the audience, at least here in the hall. And we hope really to have at least 15-20 minutes for that at the end of the launch today. So please, with regards to that, please try and ask short and precise questions. That will help you as well to get a satisfactory answer. We're a bit like politicians, and we'll talk around and round and round and round. So we'll conclude the book launch at 8 p.m. Sharp. If you want a copy of the book yourself, it's actually possible to buy a copy from Norli, the bookshop here, downstairs in the Literature House. There's a whole pile of them down there. So they're for sale. If you don't want to buy it today, you can buy it tomorrow, whatever. And for those joining online, it's also possible actually to buy the book, of course, on Amazon or directly as well from the publisher. That publisher is Bergen Books. Okay? So, with that done, let's move on. Click. So, yes. Sovereignty matters. An email marked urgent arrived in my inbox in December 2016. Given that messages sent to academics are rarely marked urgent, this mail stood out amongst the list of other emails from students and colleagues. It had been sent with a red flag from someone I barely knew in Colombia. I'd met Hector Jaime Vinasco some months before at a research conference in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, but he was not an academic. Hector Jaime, as I'd learned in Santa Cruz, is a community leader from one of Colombia's indigenous communities in the Choco region. He had participated with surprising oratory skills in the event in Santa Cruz, along with another colleague, to publicly highlight the campaign he and his people had been involved in throughout his life. Hector Jaime's eloquent presentation contained a series of important insights, but also a positioning on self-determination I had not heard stated so directly by indigenous leaders I had met before. We are the state, Hector Jaime announced. When the Colombian state arrives to negotiate with us our claims of ownership to land and resources, we respond, we are the state in this land, not you. The community had earlier elected Hector Jaime governor of the Indigenous Reserve. Having completed his period of service in that role, he had moved with the community's agreement into the role of heading a committee focused on local environmental challenges. This was connected to an effort to confront the extractive interests of private corporations and the Colombian state within their territory. Hector Jaime was involved in a campaign aimed at the defense of his community's land from encroachment from large-scale mining and other commercial interests. This was the continuation of a long history of struggle, in which, despite the formal title given to the reserve in the mid-1500s, it had been necessary to constantly innovate institutional and political action in order to defend their territory. While Hector Jaime's territory had a history and tradition of small-scale artisanal mining, his community feared the consequences that large-scale mining and oil and gas exploration could have on the local environment. The community was well aware of the experience of other communities in Colombia and elsewhere in which extractive activities had directly damaged and restricted the local water supply, as well as further restricting their sustainable use of the land for small-scale agriculture, hunting and fishing. Hector Jaime's email related to this historical context, but its urgency was caused by a more recent and vital event. Hector Jaime was trying to make contact because he now feared for his life. He had received an anonymous telephone message stating that an assassin, or sicario, had been hired by a backroom or criminal organization to kill him and his immediate family within the coming days and weeks. A letter posted through his door further suggested that the order related to the work he and his fellow community members were doing to block mining and other extractive activities entering their legal territory. The letter from the backroom organization placed this in its own twisted moral terms of social cleansing. The letter, as you can see here, the letter states, "We're not going to permit saboteurs like you to continue torpedoing the development of the country and the progress of good people." It continues by stating, "We have our orders to bring down those leaders and governors who support mobilization for the defense of development, loyalty, and economic patrimony of the country." Hector Jaime's email pleaded for assistance to push, by signature campaign, post, and telephone, the national police and authorities to take this threat to his life seriously by providing protection and investigating the case. This is not exactly what happened. Hector Jaime and his family continue to live in fear despite the email campaign by colleagues from around the world. Direct protection by the state was not granted, but as a result of outside pressure, Hector Jaime was offered a bulletproof vest, and the national police increased patrols of the area. A formal investigation to identify the source of the death threat was also started. Reflecting more recently on this moment, Hector Jaime, who has graciously provided consent to its recount, is quick to point out that this threat was not only to his person, but also to his community and to their way of life. Now, I start with this story not only to emotively grab attention, but to also immediately exemplify the key analytic intention of this volume. That is, to insist that sovereignty is a vital matter. Sovereignty is a matter that is directly implicated in questions of land, territory, and energy development, and a matter that persists as one of life and death for people in Latin America and further afield. It plays a key role in making the material, that is natural resources and their human value, political. In recent decades, globalization and the dominance of the market economy made it appear that the importance of the state, and with it of sovereignty, was on the wane. Commodity markets, the sale of primary export of raw materials, no longer appeared for many to be dictated by the interests of individual states and resource availability. They seemed largely controlled and guided by the operation of stock markets, trading algorithms, corporations, and shareholder interests. At least this was the case until price fluctuations in the price of oil, coal, and other minerals, and the knock-on effects of the prices of food and other essential goods would intermittently remind us of the facts. States not only continue to regulate for markets, but through the setting of tariffs, rents, and prices via bilateral agreements or through negotiating bodies such as OPEC, they've continued to hold significant sway over the economy. As I write this chapter, the price of oil in the US has fallen below zero for the first time in history. And the oil economy in Norway, where I live, is under serious stress because of the fall in international prices. It was only an ideological sleight of hand that created the impression that it was the market that mattered and not the state, or the state's sovereign claims on territory and resources. This magic of the market has evidently been significantly dispelled in recent years, and not only because of the instability of the international markets and fluctuations of prices. As Piketty has newly reminded us, markets, profits, and capital are all historical constructs that depend on choices, and these choices are expressed as ideological assertions. In recent years, it is clear from the election of an increasing number of populist right-wing leaders who formally denounce liberal globalists that the magic of globalization in the market and the role of the state is being reworked. A new ideological sleight of hand is taking place to put a new and very troubling emphasis on the state and sovereignty, whilst also protecting business. New policies for immigration, border control, and a relaxation of environmental regulations, as well as political decisions such as Brexit and the building of the wall on the US-Mexican border, are all evidence of this. The COVID-19 pandemic has also had an impact, enabling states to express their sovereignty over land and territory in new ways, such as mandating curfews and the electronic surveillance of citizens as possible carriers of the virus. You've all signed the list, haven't you, outside? Sovereignty is an issue that evidently still matters at the global scale. However, as this book makes clear, it is also important to draw attention to the persisting importance of sovereignty at other scales and of its empirical implication in concrete decisions regarding the direction of development, livelihood and opportunities of individuals and their communities. Indeed, as I will stress, sovereignty is significantly implicated in the vital matter of national, regional, and local decisions regarding the ownership, use, protection, and management of natural resources. In this regard, Hector Jaime's story is not an exceptional event. His experience is but a drop in the ocean of a myriad of histories of indigenous, peasant, and pastoralist communities that have been threatened in their struggles to defend their culture, autonomy, and territories. These struggles are to some extent well known from earlier anthropological texts and the publicity of international work towards the establishment of conventions to recognize and defend indigenous rights. The coverage made by the media and environmentalists of high-profile clashes over land and resources, think about Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline in the United States, or the Alberta tar sands in Canada, the Belmonte Dam in Brazil, the Chevron case in Ecuador, Yanacocha in Peru, Garzweiler in Germany, Repurposed in Norway, have all raised public awareness that the environment remains a focus of severely opposing opinions. However, what has not been given so much attention is the fact that there are signs that the pace and severity of these clashes have newly escalated. The assassination of people in similar position to Hector Jaime has become an all too regular occurrence in multiple locations around the world. In its 2019 report, the international human rights organization Global Witness highlighted that on average, more than 3 land defenders, that is, people who are civil society leaders, human rights activists, indigenous and peasant leaders, etc., were killed every week in 2018. As the report states, these attacks were driven by destructive industries such as mining, logging, and agribusiness. In their 2020 report, this is even worse. So for this year, it's even worse. It also reveals in detail how countless more people were threatened, arrested, or thrown in jail for daring to oppose the governments or companies seeking to profit from their land. Concerned about the rising trend of violence towards land defenders, The Guardian newspaper in the UK has launched a database together with Global Witness in an attempt to accurately record and map what they view to be a murder epidemic. Within these figures, the post-conflict violence in Colombia stands out. It ranks 3rd after the Philippines and Brazil, although this year it ranks 1st. Despite the signing of a peace accord in 2016 with the main guerrilla organization, the FARC, in the intervening years until May 2019, a total of 837 activists were killed in Colombia. The Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, has been closely following the rise in the assassinations of civil society leaders, including a list of names of the dead in its monthly human rights updates on Colombia. These killings have occurred in a context in which the victims have denounced the increasing presence of armed actors in their community or territory. Recent paramilitary and criminal actions are also tied to significant efforts to expand interests over a wider spectrum of resource extraction. For example, timber, mining, and oil and gas extraction. Paramilitary interests in extractive projects are driven by the possibility of profits from extortion and protection rackets, from the direct control of mining operations, from the whitewashing of money through legitimate business, a long-time strategy of the cartels, as well as deals with mining and oil companies interested in bumping up the security in the face of increasing tension and conflict with local communities. In the recent COVID-19 pandemic, media reports suggest that paramilitary and related criminal organizations exploited the lockdown as a means to further locate and target their victims. People were sheltering at home. This also unfortunately coincides with the Colombian government's own efforts to put in place online consultations as a means to speed up the extractive licensing process during the pandemic. By placing an emphasis on sovereignty, this book seeks to study the lesser-known backstory to resource contestations in Latin America, some more violent than others, and to demonstrate their positioning within more extensive histories. In doing so, I revisit previous writing linking Latin America's economic development to the exploitation of natural resources, and return to a lesser-known literature underlining the operation and importance of subnational claims to sovereignty, territory, and resources. A new connection is made here between the complex dynamics of conflict and contestation of resource extraction in Bolivia, Guatemala, and Colombia. It will become evident that the politics of resource use in these three countries inherits and differently reformulates largely forgotten but still influential histories of colonization, state formation, racism, and social exclusion. It is this ongoing history in which the formation of claims to sovereignty are not only formulated by states alone, but also by the dynamic interaction between states and communities and private actors in connection with international interests and pressures. Differing understandings of access to territory and natural resources and the expansion and governance of extractive activities are also emphasized here as an important catalyst for extractive activities. As an important catalyst and cause for contrasting expressions of sovereignty. Sovereign Forces aims to provide new and necessary insights into the causes, dynamics, and necessary governance responses to socio-environmental contestation of natural resource extraction and related energy developments in Latin America. It does so by emphasizing the political nature of resource extraction and energy production, and the analytic value of the concept of what I call resource sovereignty. Resource sovereignty is a compound concept that my colleagues and I have proposed in earlier work, but I intend to further detail and clarify in this volume. Put simply, resource sovereignty is a hybrid concept that recognizes the manner in which different social sectors bracket material interests and social claims together to form political claims for land and territory. As we will see in the following, in the rest of the book, claims of popular sovereignty often directly challenge those of the state and market, and in doing so can be generative of conflict and contestation, but also, and I place an emphasis here as well, but also of proposals for necessary transformation and cooperation, cuts both ways. Emphasizing the way in which popular expressions of sovereignty interact with dominant expressions of state and corporate sovereignty, the book captures the way in which people at both the center and the margins in Latin America relate to questions of energy and resource extraction. The book reveals anew the surprising centrality of indigenous and peasant peoples, often considered to be marginalized populations, in legitimately answering key questions regarding resource use, extraction, and energy development in Latin American countries. As such, a critical view of resource politics and environmental governance in the region highlights an analytical and practical need to reinstate a substantive consideration of their claims to sovereignty in the present. By drawing attentions to histories of grievance and contrasting epistemologies and ontologies, the argument developed here for resource sovereignty importantly contrasts and expands beyond earlier catch-all explanations of what might otherwise call a resource curse, and importantly questions persistently dominant institutionalist and rational choice assumptions in the resource politics and environmental governance literature. These points will be given further foundation in the rest of this chapter, and will also be given further foundation in the rest of the book. And I think actually at that point I want to give it a rest with my reading voice, and maybe we can turn over to some discussion as well, my colleagues as well.
Thank you. Should I lift the microphone, or can I? Okay, I have to lift the microphone. Okay, no, that's fine. Yes, you need a pen, John.
I do. I have to learn. It's a process of learning.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for being invited. It's a great honor. And when I received the email from John, I said yes, I think sort of instantly, because I thought this is very important. I've had a pleasure of working with John on a few projects, and we've had lots of interesting discussions and research projects together, so I was very happy. I also said yes because I think we have to realize in our day and age that the state is a mystery. The state is a mystery. Perhaps not in Norway. Here we all think we know what the state is, but in many places around the world, the state is a bit of a mystery. How can it be accessed? Who represents it? How can it be appropriated? What is its symbolic universe, etc., etc., etc. And I think also trying to work closer to understand what the state is more important than ever because of this, because of its continuous opacity around the world. And I think also it's important to acknowledge that we can no longer uphold the kind of images of the state that were developed in a kind of ordered European industrial society of the 1900s. Yeah? Or, of course, we can no longer rely on Hobbes to tell us what sovereignty is. Yeah? So we need to continually try to work to understand what the state is around the world, and this is precisely what I think John has done in this book. He has done it, of course, by pluralizing sovereignty, which Hobbes would have turned in his grave if he had heard. You know, sovereignty is, of course, the kind of principle of a oneness of one sovereign figure, the king being, of course, the epitome. John has upturned all that and talks about a pluralized form of sovereignty, or at least plural forces of sovereignty. This can perhaps also be a question to you. The whole argument about sovereignty being one and there being many forces to it is one type of argument you seem to be having. The other seems to be that sovereignty is in itself pluralized. Yeah. So this is something you can perhaps also comment on. This is something I really appreciate, and I learned a lot. Another thing I learned from the book, which I also really appreciate, is your willingness to humanize struggles and also to politicize struggles. So I read your whole book also as an argument against the simple statement of people struggle because they're greedy, because they're poor and they're marginalized, and thereby, with that type of argument, you depoliticize people, you depoliticize struggles, and you also effectively dehumanize the marginalized and the poor. And I really appreciate your opposition to that. I think also your book, I'm sorry, these are just some general comments first, John. Your book links to broader trends in lots of the kind of literature on post-colonial states or state formations or state orders. Of course, one central argument there has been that sovereignty is no longer residing in a center. Perhaps it's never resided in a center. Perhaps that's just a working political fiction. But at least now it's acknowledged by researchers that sovereignty no longer resides in centers, metropolitan centers, in capitals, etc., etc. Rather, it's pushed to the peripheries where it's contested. Yeah, and this is what you show, I think. So my first question to you, perhaps then, is would you say that what we before argued to be the case, that sovereignty is pushed to the margins there, and that's where sovereignty is contested in a sense, would you say that this is now reflecting a much broader trend, that this argument can also be globalized? Can you sort of lift your arguments from this book and to make a kind of a global claim? I ask also because, as you also did now in an introduction, you mentioned Repparfjorden, yeah? Would you, for instance, could you make the same claim about Norway in that sense, yeah? Or is this, in a sense, state 2.0 in a sense, yeah? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is what I'm saying. I mean, so, you know, I've written about very specific location. I've been written about 3 different countries in Latin America. And so the you know, the empirical details of the book really, you know, they are very specific to those locations. But the broader argument around sovereignty and the pluralization of sovereignty, or the contested nature of sovereignty, I think is something that is actually quite global in its nature. You know, I know that there has been a special case being made, for example, by Steputaten Blom-Hansen, to try and say that, you know, that this the contested nature of sovereignty is has a particular form in post-colonial states. And that may well be the case, but I think that it's also quite clearly evidence as well of the fact that state formation in Europe and state formation everywhere has always been contested. There have always been forces, there have always been opposition against what the state represents, but not only opposition in the sense of just direct clashes, you know, an effort to try and overthrow, but also basically to rework what the state means. You know, the actual, our understanding of what the state is. What is the state in terms of its boundaries, but also what is the state in terms of what a state does for its populace.
All right, I would agree with that. But how do you determine if there is a state in operation or not, in a sense? I mean, you can push the argument very far. You can say a state is pluralized. It's now everywhere. It can be appropriated. It can be instantiated. But how do you determine whether there is a state, whether there is a principle of sovereignty in operation? I mean, can you exemplify from your book so we get a more of a grasp of when you think it's viable or helpful to talk about sovereignty or a state in operation?
Well, I mean, the book has a lot about history in it. So yes. there's a lot of history in it. Probably too much for some readers out there. There's a bit too much history, but I must admit I do enjoy my history a lot.
I do as well.
And I think it has a lot of importance as well for understanding as well the way in which states come into being. And states come into being through different political forces, different periods of time. The book goes through, you know, describing, you know, conquest, colonialism, republicanism, and the formation of modern states. It talks a lot about the formation as well of institutions, which are sort of representative bodies as well of the state to the people. But in that also it describes as well the way in which those institutions have also always been in formation. They're never fully formed. And that's one of the particularities yes. as well of perhaps Latin America or post-colonial states more compared to Europe, is that you don't get a sense of a solid state, which we might have had in Europe because of the formation of institutions that last. In Latin America and many other places in the post-colonial world, you have institutions which are extremely unstable. that are constantly being reformulated to the point where, even, what we would think is kind of the basics of political formation in terms of political parties, representative bodies, etc., all of that is also constantly in flux. And that's much more, that's a kind of a particular feature, as it were, of these post-colonial states compared to European states. But although European states, you have much more of a sense of stability in terms of institutional formation and what all those institutions do, I think that we would also, we should not be fooled to believe that they are actually so solid. The reality is that they're not that solid, and there are many examples of where, the fact is that we begin to realize the magic or the lie of the state in terms of when the state doesn't step up for its populace, or where also it crumbles apart for different reasons. And so we have also moments in history in Europe as well where the state has utterly failed.
If I can have one more question before I leave the floor to my two colleagues there, it's another feature I really enjoyed, but also was a bit puzzled by in your book, was your hopefulness, in a sense. I mean, you write with a kind of a hope. I mean, of course, the easiest position to be in as an academic is sort of a retreat into some kind of pessimism and cynicism. Yeah, so I really also admire that, but it is quite interesting, because you seem to, in a sense, indicate that these plural states or state orders where you have plural sovereignties emerging in the kind of the resource context might work. Yeah, they might work. And being someone who's worked in Mozambique for 20 years, as I have, and now with the new war in northern Mozambique with Salafists and Total and Rwandan imperial interests and geopolitical imperial interests, a kind of resource conflict in one sense, but immensely complex. I'm not that optimistic. And I also have been reading, perhaps I shouldn't have, because it made me also very pessimistic, but Mike Savage's new book, The Return of Inequality. He writes about the fact that we live in a world now where you have increasing inequality, and he actually sees a kind of a retreat into old forms of wealth accumulation, yeah, where you have huge corporations, families, etc., controlling wealth, controlling territories, controlling people, and a retreat of rights-based kinds of orders or human rights, or the idea of the nation state also retreating. So please help us out. Why are you optimistic? Why is this? Why are you so hopeful, John?
The glass is always half full. Right? So it's about how you interpret it. I mean, I guess I'm like you. There are moments of utter despair, right? And the book doesn't. I mean, to be fair to myself, the book doesn't. It doesn't shy away from describing the horror, right? So there's enough horror in the book for those that are looking for horror stories. There's enough of that in there.
Yes.
So and so some days I'm absolutely filled with utter despair about the conditions of politics and the way in which that it has such a destructive effect on these societies that I describe in the book. And so there's no doubt that there is an utter despair there. But I think that to leave it at utter despair as well is actually too much of a luxury. And what I mean by that is that the people that I've worked with in those communities, they can't afford to be in despair. They can't afford to sit down and just give up, because then they're absolutely screwed, right? Then they're done, and they've gone through. They've gone through hell. I mean, they've gone through all forms of different forms of violence and war. They've gone through periods as well of political turmoil, of revolution, of massive transformations. They've experienced all of that, and they could easily, give up because of the way in which things have never really sufficiently turned in their favor. But they know that they haven't got a choice to just sit down and accept the conditions as they are. They haven't got a choice. They have to keep on pushing. They have to keep up the optimism. And I guess what the book does is actually, it reflects like a mirror, you know, the optimism, the surprising optimism of figures like Hector Jaime Vinasco, who I mentioned at the beginning, but also many others who I've met from other communities, you know, from Colombia to Bolivia to Guatemala, where there is an amazing ability, despite all of the threat, despite all of the danger of getting up off their ass and trying to fight for something better, that they do it, they take their risk. And that means that they will actually also put themselves in harm's way. But they are optimistic about the future because they haven't actually got a choice. It's only us that sit here in comfortable Europe that can have that sort of sense of utter despair, because we can feel that, you know, we've got the luxury of having the space to feel despair whilst we're sitting watching the TV. But a lot of these people don't have that, and there just there isn't room for it. There's not time for that, and so there has to be an effort to try and rally the forces of themselves as individuals, and rally as well as communities as well, in order to try and test the possibilities of transforming the state and of transforming sovereignty for the better. Thanks. Mariel, I think.
Thank you. Just some water. Okay. Thank you very much, John, for inviting me to comment your book. It's been a pleasure to read it, and I really mean it. It's been like at some points I couldn't leave the book aside because it was so interesting. So I really appreciate the invitation. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach than what Bjørn did. But I will just like to add to what Bjørn said, that you know, it's also the turn that you have taken into trying to understand states or what's happening to states in Latin America is particularly interesting in the era of the Sustainable Development Goals, in which the states or the state has become only another stakeholder in line with corporations and NGOs. And also, as we were talking, I think it was last week, with the frontier of extraction is expanding to unimaginable frontiers, like and the space, you know, is open, is up for grabs, or on deep seas. So I think that's very interesting. And what I would like to do now is to take you to 2015, back to 2015, and to Guatemala. And where I come from Guatemala, but I also have done a lot of research in Guatemala and other parts of Central America. But in 2015, the United Nations Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala and the Office of the Attorney General revealed a series of corruption cases involving the president and the vice president of the country. And when those news came out, people took to the streets in massive and sustained protests that lasted 6 months. The vice president resigned in April and the president in September. In total, 70 people accused of involvement in corruption, including illegal financing, embezzlement, and money laundering, were arrested. And protests took many forms of expression, like dancing in public spaces and playing music, marching, and there was really a feeling of carnival to the protests. It was a happy event in a way. And it attracted the support from people from all ages and socioeconomic and political backgrounds, in a movement that can't really be called a mass movement against corruption, which is one of the endemic problems of Latin America. And the protests and the outcome were spectacular and euphoric. Imagine, you throw down the government, or the president has to resign. And I think the success of the protests surprised everyone, and most of all the protesters themselves. And to me, what was most surprising, perhaps, was how peaceful and colorful the protests were. And naturally, the protests received a lot of attention in national and international media. And while this was happening in the capital city of Guatemala, I was doing field work in southeast Guatemala in research that is related to anti-mining protests against to El Escobal mining project, which you mentioned in your book. And this is like 250 kilometers away from the capital city, and it's really a different world. It's another world, another planet. So in many conversations I had with the indigenous activists and indigenous rights activists and what is called land defenders, who were then working towards organizing a consultation and protest and trying to get, the right to be heard and consulted about the very mining project. And what they did is that they laughed many times at the naivety of the people from the city. My Xinca interlocutors explained to me how much history matters, how time can be played with, how the organization of space changed political opportunities and tactics, and how important it is to have access to a variety of a repertoire of tactics within a long-term strategy of reclaiming their rights. Because for them it was not a matter of this mine or of this year, it's 100 years history. And I think that the Xinca activists I work with will agree with much of what you have written in the book, John. And I think that they will agree in particular with the relevance of apprehending and comprehending the diverse repertoire of possibilities with which one can achieve, or they, indigenous activists, engage with. And this includes contestation, confrontation, but also the legal strategies at both national and international levels. They have won incredible legal battles in international courts, and the building of alliances with others, which has been very important. And I must say that I feel very privileged because I have been able to following closely the process about El Escobal mine for over 10 years. And I think that having time and not being pressed to write and publish quickly after you have done a field season is crucial for understanding the complexity of things that are happening in many places of the world. And I think that this is one of the strengths of your books, John. You have a solid empirical base that has been built through many years of work in different contexts in Latin America. And from there you can build really exciting theoretical provocations, because I think that much of what you do in the book is a provocation, indeed. And I think that long engagement allows for producing analysis that capture the ambiguities and contradictions involved in claims to sovereignty. And those of us who have followed your work might have, of course, noticed that in your work you are concerned with opening the possibilities of explaining complexity by challenging established, popular, pessimistic, and romanticized perspectives. I think that when I read Sovereign Forces, I felt that it is a continuation of a project and some ideas that you started to play with in your article, Beyond the Permitted Indian. And this is an article from 2008 in which you suggested that despite the effectivity of El Indio Permitido, or the permitted Indian, and I think I have been talking with you about that as well, as a tool of governance, the controls of the neoliberal cultural project are imperfect. And this might be a very, maybe it's a little bit out of place claim, but I think that history is giving John, is telling us that John is right, or was right, might be right in his interpretation of contemporary waves of indigenous protests as challenges to the permissible and as catalysts for the redefinition of society and government. But let's get back to Guatemala, because the history is, it's not as good or as happy as it appeared at the beginning. So a new government canceled the mandate of the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala in 2019. The person who was Attorney General in 2015 lives in exile now. And meanwhile, corruption has reached new levels in the country as politicians associated to drug cartels have secure positions in the parliament. And the COVID-19 crisis has given new opportunities to government officials to enrich themselves illegally. But meanwhile, the Xinca activists with whom I have worked accomplished things that are important. On June 2017, the Supreme Court of Guatemala ordered the El Escobal silver mine to temporarily stop operations due to the mine's failure to consult indigenous people. The Xinca organization installed a road blockade after the ruling of the court in 2017, and on September 3rd in 2018, the Constitutional Court issued a decisive ruling that suspended operations of the mine and halted its exploration and exploitation work, ordering the company to consult with surrounding Xinca indigenous communities. The mine has not been in operation since 2017, and that is a fact. A consultation is under planning, and that is another fact. And I think that, just to conclude, my reference to these two events in Guatemala, the short-lived and, I will say, unsuccessful movement against corruption, and the long history of Xinca rights claims and the closing of the mine, highlight the relevance of how in you know, this small, one of these shithole countries, as Trump will say, will call it, how institutions are fluid and unstable, but they give like two different outcomes almost at the same, during the same period of time. And I think that that's very interesting for understanding political outcomes of popular mobilizations, but with a historical perspective, not just looking at that spectacular, beautiful, colorful, moving protests. And I think that the book allows us to illuminate in what ways and to what extent land defenders and indigenous activists, by their conflictual engagement with extractive projects, are becoming visible bodies, sayable names, and audible voices in ways that disrupt the given order of domination in Latin America. But then, so what? I'm sorry, but this, you know, it's like, how can we, how this knowledge that you have generated and that maybe you and I agree, how that could have an impact on the everyday challenges that land defenders face. Not least the threats to the very livelihoods, because as you said when you introduced the book, those are vital matters. And Berta Cáceres was assassinated around the same time. And you mentioned that this knowledge might be useful or highlight the necessary governance responses, but it's how we get there. So my questions are, you know, how could we talk about this book and its contents and the work that we do in ways that are accessible for people in the places where we do work, because they don't, I mean, they are not here, they don't read English, and if they read English, it might be the book is too expensive, and all these limits, you know, that are there. And I'm going to tell you my 3 questions, and you can then just answer them if you want. But there are also other movements in Latin America, and I think that this is just gives very much optimism. But I'm thinking about the movements like abortion rights and the fight for abortion rights that have first Argentina and now Mexico how can this idea of sovereignty and sovereign, the idea that you launch in the book could be used to understand all these other things? Because in many women in Guatemala, in Latin America, are talking about the body as territory. And the last one you don't need to answer, but it's undeniable the importance of illegal actors and drug cartels in many of the places where you work. And will you say that the concept of resource sovereignty will help us better understand drug cartels' territorial claims, and how is that problematic, or what do you think about that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mariel. These are great comments. There's a lot in them as well, and there's a lot for me to take with me and think more about as well. So I don't necessarily have very perfect answers to in large degree, but so first of all, I think we have to get it straight. What I'm trying to argue is that sovereignty is a fight. Democracy is a fight. The state is a fight. And that fight isn't one that's just won with one battle. It's a fight that happens over generations. And there are multiple sides to that fight. There are multiple stakeholders, there are multiple interests that are involved in that fight. And so when we're talking about resource sovereignties, pluralized, we're actually also referring not only to the sovereignties that we perhaps want to have as part of that fight, but we also have to accept that there are sovereignties being expressed as well, which are undesirable sovereignties, undesirable claims on the state, undesirable claims on the state's territory as well, whether it be from, for example, illegal actors, or whether it be from corrupt individuals in business, etc. I mean, so that we have to accept that this is a fight. It cuts both ways in that way. And it's a long business. It's a process that takes place over a long period of time. And some gains are made, some wins are also formed, whether it be through legal process or other forms of process. And one of the things that I've tried to do in the book is to describe that rich, the rich dynamic, the rich innovation that actually social movements are involved in order to try and experiment with trying to take on the state. And the multiple mechanisms that they try to actually do that with as well. And that isn't just getting out in the streets and carrying placards. And it's not just also, punching a policeman in the face. It's not only that, it's also, I mean, it is that, so don't get me wrong, it is that. And that's important too, guys, so I don't get that wrong either. But it is also taking part in other things which are, on the one hand, much more peaceful and colourful. You mentioned carnival. I mean, many of the people I've worked with in Colombia are also similarly have adopted a style of protest as carnival, or carnival as protest. It's kind of hard to know what the dividing line is between those two things. And so there is that, but they also use law. So there's, law has also, increasingly as law has become a kind of an important space for the regulation by states and corporations. Also, local communities are recognized as well that those spaces are where they have to meet the state and corporations. And so law courts and law and decisions outside of court, all of that have also become important spaces as well, where people push and use their techniques in order to try and win change. And they do win change, as you mentioned. But these are small changes over, small spaces, small wins along the way. It's very rare that you get a massive win, a massive transformation, which is for the better. And all I can say, I don't have the solution for Guatemala, for Colombia, or for Bolivia. But what I say is that, history is not ended. History is not finished. And it will be written, we have to follow what's going on there. And what I do know is that with every passing year, the intensity, but also the ability of these social movements to also take on the state with all of these different mechanisms is growing. There is a learning process in this as well. And it can only be, it's going to be, that there has to be some major shifts on their way because of that. There's quite likely to be major shifts because of that along the way in the near future because of that. So I'm optimistic in that regard. optimistic about the possibilities for them, to have learned enough to actually make those shifts occur. They're not going to be shifts that make democracy or the state or sovereignty perfect, because I said sovereignty is a fight. It will always be a fight. It's never going to be, this is an unending fight that has to be taken by those groups. But so it's a fight, and there are desirable parts of that, and there are undesirable parts of that. And then these illegal actors are undoubtedly, to be contended with within that whole picture. It's very interesting how little of the writing around Latin American states, at least the political science around the formation of states in Latin America, how little of that actually deals with illegal actors. Very little writing on them. Similarly, when we talk about economic development in Latin America, almost none of it talks about the informal economy. I mean, we all know about the operation of the cartels, but we don't really have that much knowledge about the way in which those illegal economies really function. So we only have really sort of, we have somewhat hearsay about the way in which they act and the way in which they influence the states. We know that they're there, but we really need to address them much more directly. We need to somehow look at the specific dynamics of those actors and see how they push on government, push on the state, push on the actions of the state. And that actually, it's only by doing that we can confront them in those small spaces with those multiple mechanisms that are being used by social movements. You mentioned abortion rights. It's clearly not my field to talk about abortion rights, but I think it's very interesting that feminist groups are pushing for an idea of the body as territory. That's not necessarily so different from communities who do not see themselves as individuals as separate from territory. There are multiple indigenous groups around not only Latin America, but around the world that do not see a separation of themselves as individuals from their community or from the land. That these are one and the same thing. They're being expressed. And so and that's a very different expression of sovereignty to make, and one that has to be contended with, and one that has relevance, I think, also for multiple spaces and multiple places in the world as well, including perhaps even here in Norway. I don't know if that addresses your questions sufficiently enough, but we can come back to it. Andrei.
What I thought of doing to start with was to maybe make a list of keywords, what this book inspired me of thinking. And I must say, first of all, thank you for asking me. This has been very exciting to read the book, and it's payment enough to get the copy. I have a weakness for books, so there you have it. So I thought, okay, I'll come up with 3 keywords, and I didn't manage to come up with 3. I came up with 4. The first one is annoying. It's annoyingly well written, the book. I didn't want to use so much time on it as I did, but I couldn't let go. So part of it is, of course, because it speaks to some of my own doubts, maybe, or investigations and questions about similar issues from other parts of the world. And part of it is the style, of course, which is catchy and it's intriguing and so on. And of course the topic, which is your approach, placing sovereignty centrally and so on, which is captivating as well. The other keyword I came up with is shocking. Not having worked in Latin America and having maybe marginal knowledge of it, I was shocked to read all the details of violence of different kinds that many of these people have been exposed to. And the detailed history that you give of marginalization, raw violence, discrimination, and so on. The third keyword I came up with was enlightening. And this is quite central to what I'm going to say, because my experience, empirical experience, comes from mostly from Asia, from Mongolia in majority, a little bit from Norway, and a little bit from Africa. So I have never set foot in Latin America except for conferences and stuff like that. Now I have been working closely with Noé on his PhD and have started to learn a bit more details. But it has been enlightening in the sense that many of the concepts that you use and theories and approaches I have used as well, but you use them differently. You use a different kind of literature. You speak differently, for instance, about territoriality, about scales, about rights. Of course, it's a common literature as well, but it's been inspiring to see maybe Spanish language literature referring to territoriality. I was aware of the different approaches, the different visions that are used in speaking about territoriality in Latin America. In my neck of the woods, when I work with nomads, let's say in Mongolia, territoriality has been useful as a counterpoint to land rights, as a formal sense of controlling land, for instance. Whereas for these people who move around, they're not so interested in owning a piece of land. They're more interested in being able to dictate what is happening in key areas that they are interested in. On the other hand, in Latin America, there's a long history of using territorio and territoriality in specific ways, which have been quite inspiring to compare to other kinds of literature and so on. And also scale. As a geographer, of course, scale is very central to many analyses of different social phenomena and so on. And the way you think about scale, keeping the national state central and so on, and then taking apart different conceptions of scale and what scales are relevant and not relevant for the phenomena you analyze is quite interesting as well. I have some critiques of that as well, but we might get some time to talk about that. Okay, the final keyword that I came up with was insightful. And it is insightful in so many ways because it's easy to see that this is a work of time, of a long period of empirical investigation, a work of love as well, probably, because it reads as such. You can see your engagement and your critical eye and so on. But it also provides an empirical acuity that you wouldn't get otherwise. You wouldn't get without long-term engagement, returning to the same places again and again, and so on. So your analysis, what I enjoyed, some of the things that I enjoyed most about it is that it goes beyond this idea of one protagonist and one antagonist. It's not always about indigenous people's good, the state bad, and so on, although there's obviously a lot of that. But you do manage to pry open these categories of the state, of the indigenous groups, of the communities, and so on. And that's exciting for me. I mean, it opens up new avenues for analysis and new understandings of social processes that are useful to understand, but also have puzzled me quite a bit in other places. So those were the keywords, and then of course I have many questions and many grumblings and reflections and so on, but it struck me as we have been discussing here that maybe one central idea here is this question of optimism. Why optimist? And I wouldn't say that in the same breath always about you. But there is optimism in there. And I was as you were discussing, I thought I jotted down some ideas, and it strikes me as maybe the beginning of your book is quite illustrative in that, because in some weird sense, the claim that this organization that was threatening the indigenous leader, the language that they used in that threat letter, in some weird sense, contains grains of optimism. The language, as you mentioned in your presentation, you mentioned twisted moral claims. And then, of course, they themselves, they say, we won't allow you to stop progress, and we won't allow you to stop good people, and so on and so on. And the weird part about it is that they have to revert to moral claims, right? They have to revert to progress, to idea of progress, to speaking on behalf of people, and so on. And that's quite central for understanding sovereignty, right? And for understanding not only that, but also institutional formation. That if you, ignoring for a minute that these guys were not trying to institutionalize something, perhaps, but the fact that in order to make legitimate claims, you have to revert to a sense of morality, to a sense of accepted moral codes or social codes, and so on. There's reason for optimism in there, because even as a violent organization and so on, you have to revert to sociality. You have to get this kind of acceptance to be able to speak on behalf of the people, right? And what I think your book does well is to turn this on its head and say, well, who are the people? Who are the voices who speak on behalf of the people? And how that is made, where does it come from historically? And why do we accept certain voices to speak on behalf of the people and create certain sovereignties versus not allowing other kinds of sovereignties, right? But I think even in the answer that this indigenous leader gives to the state, here we are the state, that in itself is a long way from I am the state, or the state is I, right? Which was the foundational view in Europe for thinking about sovereignty, right? But that also, that's, you could say, that's optimism in itself, because he speaks of we are the state, not me as the leader of this community and so on. It also could mean that there are other ways of looking at the world, ontological claims, right? It's always about us, and probably within that us, it's not only humans, it's not only living people, it might also be ancestors that are also in many parts of the world conceived as being part of the legitimate us. But it also speaks to, or maybe it kind of entices us to think more about where our European ideas of sovereignty come from. And I think we discussed this briefly today at the office about this, what I think is a quite influential reference on the topic, Saskia Sassen's work on authority, rights and territoriality, where she goes on to analyze where does the idea of the national state in Europe come from and so on. And one important point that she makes is that to make the transition from the God-like sovereignty that was associated with the kings in Europe, it needed this kind of social legitimacy in order to make that transition to maybe a social sovereignty or more democratic sovereignty and so on. So my maybe two points of reflections are with regard to this empirical acuity that I was mentioning earlier, that the insights that we as readers get into these case studies that you present. For me, it would have been insightful. I lacked a bit of what are the livelihoods of these peoples? because I think that would have also maybe allowed us to get different kinds of insights into why do they think about land, resources, territoriality in particular ways. So that's one thing that I maybe would have liked to see more of. The other thing is what you just mentioned just before, this idea of small wins. And I think going back to this, to the way we speak about, to the necessity of making moral claims rather than raw power, raw law-based claims. For me, it's also the way the language is used is quite interesting here, I think. And throughout the book, you refer several times to struggles over meaning, not only power, or power struggles over meaning. What does it mean to rule in certain ways? What does it mean to have a particular set of institutions rather than others? And I maybe would, I don't know if you think that would be a powerful analytical reflection, maybe more woven together, this idea of language and what does it reflect in terms of what is valued in certain circles. So I'll stop there and maybe we can pick up later.
So these are, again, are great comments as well, and a lot to take with me. One of the things that's important to emphasize is that, yes, this book was written over many years, or rather it was an idea that was forming in my head for many years. At the same time, it's also a bit of an accidental book. Because this isn't a product of a particular research project. So I didn't go out to research these communities with the idea that research would lead to the writing of this book. This is, as I explained as well in the introduction, this is very much a patchwork of moments of my own research and moments of my own experience over the years that have been basically just stuck together. I mean, so I'll be very honest with you. It's not a really well-planned project, you know. This is like it's a bit like the accidental researcher, where things don't really work out always the way you want either. Where that you think that you're going to go off and research one thing and then another thing happens, or you think you're going to talk to someone, because you think that they're so important for your research, and it ends up that you can't talk to them, but you end up talking to someone else, and things just don't turn out the way you want. Right? They just don't turn out the way you want. But there's something to be learned from that experience as well. So this book is like that, right? It's an attempt to say that actually a lot of the things that you kind of push to the side, things that kind of happen, as I've said in one chapter, out of the corner of your eye, are actually also important. And sometimes it's worthwhile going back and reflecting over how the dots connect together, because then you see the full picture. And so there's a value in doing that, but I admit that there are things that I've lost in that, and perhaps that comes back to you, Andrei, in terms of placing more of an emphasis perhaps on livelihoods and language, and how that's tied up as well with moral claims and the moral understanding of the land and landscape. So there are elements of that just aren't here. They're not captured here because I just don't have it. I just don't have that available to me. I think that would have required a true anthropological work that was focused, that worked in one place and really dug deep and explored that with intention over time. And I haven't done that. That's not this book, at least. Having said that, morality certainly is something that I consider. Morality or moral, the understanding that landscape, nature, resources are not just they're not just to be valued with economic value. They are also valued as well from other lenses, and particularly other moral lenses. And so there are the people that I describe in this book. look at the landscape and look at the land in quite a distinct way very often vis-a-vis the state. They look very differently at it, especially when we look at, the land and landscape very differently, for example, from these paramilitary organizations or criminal organizations who only see the land as as something to be used for extraction, to be torn apart, to be removed in order to gain economic value. Here there's another expression of the land and its value being made as well by these people. And so I do try and place that center stage. And if you don't mind, see time's running, but I actually wouldn't mind just reading you another little bit of my book, if you don't mind. Because it kind of plays to this. It plays to this whole moral landscapes, right? So I'm moving on in the book, and here's actually, let me just stand it there. And I'll sit down again, I promise you. That's too far. There we go. So this, of course, is a picture on the front of the book, and it's a picture, actually, of leaching ponds for lithium production in the highlands of Bolivia on the Salar de Uyuni. This is the largest salt flat in the world, and it's actually, the salt flat is also one of several other salt flats in the high Andes between Chile and Argentina. And these salt flats contain the largest reserves of lithium in the world. So when you're thinking about your electric cars in the future, it's highly likely that the lithium will have come from here. So let me read. Citizens of lithium and salt, a low and eerie howl produced by a constant cold wind is now all that blows through the rusting smokestacks of the hulks collected in a locomotive graveyard on the outskirts of the Altiplano town of Uyuni. For close to a century, salt and dust have sandblasted and corroded the remains of these trains, leaving a ghostly but picturesque sight. All guided tours of the area add a stop to this industrial mausoleum to their itineraries. Most of the trains in the graveyard date back to the end of the 19th century and were imported by a then imperial and corporate Britain to establish Uyuni as an important transportation hub. Engineers invited to Bolivia by the British-sponsored Antofagasta and Bolivia railway companies built the railway lines between 1888 and 1892 to assist with the transport of minerals from the Andes to the Pacific Ocean ports. The trains are not only a reminder of the bygone age of steam power, but of Bolivia's much longer history as an exporter of raw materials to the world. Slowly becoming the skeletons of once great machines, the trains are a reminder of the periods of both boom and bust that have excited and plagued the country's economic and political development. The Spanish, in common with the outlaws Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, were drawn to Bolivia because of gold and silver. But other minerals have also had their economic magnetism. From the 19th century onwards, the mining industry also focused on the extraction and export of tin. Individuals made vast fortunes. Simón Patiño, a Bolivian industrialist, became one of the world's richest men in the resource-hungry period of the Second World War. Yet the prices would not only rise, but also fall, and little wealth remained for the benefit of most people in the country. In the 1940s, mineral markets in Bolivia suffered one of their moments of collapse. Other severe periods of bust were experienced in the 1910s and 1980s, only to be overcome by new mineral discoveries and new mining technologies. At that time, many trains were abandoned outside Uyuni, forming the start of this collection of mortal engines. However, the train cemetery, despite its aesthetic and historical interest, is not the main attraction that draws visitors to the region. Uyuni is now less known as an important highland transport hub, and more so as the nearest town to the world's largest area of salt flats, the Salar de Uyuni. The Salar de Uyuni is a vast salt flat spanning almost 11,000 square kilometers in the department of Potosí at an altitude of 3,656 meters above sea level. Here, a thick crust of salt extends to the horizon, covered by quilted polygonal patterns of salt rising from the ground. Some 40,000 years ago, it was part of a lake that covered a large swathe of the Andean highlands. The moon-like landscape of the salt desert are part of what was left when it dried up. At certain times of the year, nearby lakes overflow and a thin layer of water transforms the flats into a stunning reflection of the sky. It's as if you're on a white ocean with no waves, Adrian Borsa, a geophysicist, told Nature. You see the horizon, the curvature of the earth. It's absolutely featureless. Stretched between distant Andean peaks like a shimmering white carpet, the Salar de Uyuni is also home to pink flamingos, 1,000-year-old cacti, rare hummingbirds, and hotels built entirely from blocks of salt. Billed by many travel guides as a must-see wonder of the world, the Salar de Uyuni now attracts 60,000 tourists a year to the area. In the nearby town of Uyuni, residents and local officials have ambitious plans for its future as a hub for tourism. Tourism has fast overtaken the rail transport of minerals, llama herding, quinoa farming, and salt production by the local indigenous Aymara population as the impoverished region's main economic activity. Tourists arriving in Uyuni find themselves in a boomtown atmosphere. Few roads are paved, rubbish blows across the streets, and the hot water and electricity supply in local hotels is intermittent and unreliable. At the same time, Wi-Fi is available, and local cafes sell stone-baked pizza, vegan options and artisanal coffee, and beer in competition with more traditional local offerings of charque, which is a dried llama meat, chuño, freeze-dried potatoes, quinoa, and api morada, a spiced corn drink. Tourists commonly enjoy these amenities for only a day or two before heading out with guided tours of 3 or 4 days. During these tours, they pass by graveyards, the graveyard of trains, on their way to cross the Salar and stop at various vantage points, sights and experiences, before looping back to Uyuni or leaving the tour at the Chilean border. On their way to the Salar, the tour commonly stops for an hour to give passing interest to one of the traditional foundations of the local economy, the production and manufacture of blocks of salt taken from the Salar itself. For hundreds of years, the natural process of salt accumulation in the area has provided local people with an important product for trade. Although trucks have now largely replaced llamas and alpacas as the beasts of burden, loads of salt blocks wrapped in pampas grass continue to be transported along ancient routes to marketplaces across the Andean highlands, valleys, and lowlands. The boom in tourism focused on the Salar has been important for Uyuni in recent years. Hopes of economic revitalization and development are currently geared towards catering for the curiosity of foreigners. However, whilst tourism captures the present, future dreams, along with renewed fears of a repeat of earlier economic patterns, have been stoked by the arrival of lithium mining. Under the white lunar expanse of the Salar, there is not only salt, but the world's largest brine deposit of lithium, a light metal increasingly sought after for the use in batteries that power everything from mobile phones to electric vehicles. Because of their high storage capacity, lithium-ion batteries are expected to make electric vehicles and renewable sources of energy like solar and wind power feasible and increasingly affordable. Recognizing the increasing value of lithium as an extractive commodity, the Bolivian government has viewed its industrialization as a part of a new era of prosperity. With exploitation of lithium in a 400 square kilometer area, we'll have enough to maintain ourselves for a century, Bolivia's president, or past president, I should say, Evo Morales boasted of the rare metal. In 2008, the industrialization of lithium was incorporated into large development plans that formally prioritize state control over natural resources, expand social programs, and express a rejection of neoliberalism. The startup of the lithium production in 2009 meant that the Salar ceased to be confined exclusively for ecologists, tourists, and salt traders. Lithium is the reason why I arrived in Uyuni in 2011. It's also a vehicle to discuss another aspect of popular sovereignty not fully explored in previous chapters. Here I emphasize that claims and contests for resource sovereignty are not only generated by economic and material claims, but often concurrently result from differing perspectives of the value and significance of the landscape and of the possible impacts of resource development. Here we witness that this is true not only of fossil fuels, but also of resources that, despite their green credentials, result in similar social and environmental impacts to what are traditionally considered to be non-renewable resources. Whilst recognizing common concerns with economic gain and employment, I highlight through this chapter's focus on the politics of the establishment of the lithium production in the highlands of Bolivia, that contrasting foundations for knowledge and ontology and changing political pacts and alliances result in dynamic expressions of, as I've said, resource sovereignty. Charting the establishment of a nascent lithium industry in Salar de Uyuni and its contested significance, I show the manner in which material claims are embedded in long-established cultural and moral relationships with the landscape. Reference and discussion are made here of developments also in social theory that link to the understanding as well of that moral nature of the landscape. So this is shown not to be a simple manner of easily distinguishable ontological positions, but rather a complex interaction in which alignments and misalignments take place over time. So in a way, that I think addresses somewhat of what Andrei mentions, but perhaps not fully, because it wasn't. I didn't have the time to sit in one place, as a, at least not for this book at least. So the book in that way is also a bit of a patchwork. Time's running, but maybe there are further questions from you guys that you would want to take, and if not, we will of course turn to the wonderful public that we have as well here as well. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have. Should I hold this? No. Yeah, okay. Trying to keep you happy. No, very interesting discussion, and I really am enjoying this. If there's one thing I would like to ask you, there are many, but one thing relates to this distinction between indigenous and non-indigenous. I mean, this is a big discussion, of course, in Latin American studies, enormous. We have similar discussions when we work in and on Africa, between sort of tradition and non-traditional, etc., etc. In the book, you sometimes write indigenous, sometimes you write claims to indigeneity, sometimes, and when you speak also now, sometimes you in a sense, enlarge the importance of the indigenous to ontological proportions. Yeah? There are ontological dimensions to this. In other aspects in your book, you write about claims to, yeah? a sort of a hyper-constructive, constructivist kind of position where there is nothing really. I mean, everything is just constructed in a sense. Could you clear this up for us? I mean, how do you distinguish analytically, and when you think about resource sovereignty, sort of differences between baseless claims to and the kind of long continuities of sociocultural systems that you also accord a kind of an ontological status?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I'm trying to argue for a kind of a super constructivist understanding of indigeneity. That's not really what I'm trying to do at all. What I'm rather pushing for more is an historical understanding of indigeneity. And that means that you have to also look at, I mean, here I'm working with 3 different countries. And in those 3 different countries, indigeneity or indigenous identity is understood differently. And it's understood differently because of the traces of history, to do with the way in which history has also formed the possibilities for indigenous communities, or their recognition as well vis-a-vis the state. And so there are different traces that are left behind by history that also kind of constrain or give possibility for people saying, I am indigenous, or I'm making a claim for being indigenous. So in Bolivia, that is a really particular, I mean, we're talking about Bolivia here with regards to the Salar. I mean, in Bolivia, it's a very particular notion of indigeneity, which is very much a stated claim, but it is also one which is also, one where there is a certain fuzziness between being indigenous and being and this has been a problem in writing this book, a sliding scale, as it were, between indigeneity and being campesino or peasant. And that has to do with Bolivian history, where actually as a result of Bolivian history, and particularly the nationalist revolution in 1952, because of that, these two categories of indigenous and peasant have become very much fused together, and people will switch between claims quite easily in the same sentence. They're both indigenous and they're peasant at the same time. Peasant being, by the way, for those that are, it's a very specific kind of understanding, campesino, but essentially peasant is very much clearly it's a class-based term. It's kind of it has an economic understanding. Peasant is about people who don't own land. That's what the peasantry are, people who don't land. They work the land, but they don't own it, right? And so after the 1952 revolution, the nationalist revolution, those that were in charge of it decided that the entire population, the rural population, were no longer to be known as being indigenous. They were now to be called campesino. They were now to become peasant. But there was also a revolt against that, or an overturning of that took place in later history, in the 1970s, where many new indigenous organizations grew up, particularly what's called the Catarista movement in Bolivia, which was to reclaim, in the face of this idea of campesino, to reclaim indigenous identity. So as a result of that, what we've ended up with, certainly in the highlands of Bolivia, is this fusing together of a class-based notion of identity with one which is much more cultural. So it becomes a confused, quite a difficult sort of slippery fuzziness that exists between these two different categories. And that's distinct as well, even just from the lowlands of the country, where this class-based understanding of identity never ever took hold. So there is so here we're seeing indigeneity or indigenous identity not being one which is just sort of, it's not just constructed by individuals or constructed by the decisions of a community, but constructed, as it were, vis-a-vis history, the history of state formation and the history of politics in these countries. Hope that answers. No, push me.
No, but I agree. You explained indigeneity as a historical process based on class, weight of history, social political formation that you need to understand and contextualize. Great, yeah. Mm-hmm. But what is the ontological kind of property? What is the ontological characteristic of that, in a sense? Because you use ontology a lot. And ontology, as we know, is about what is, in a sense. Yeah.
So I use ontology, but I guess it's been one of the kind of the what we would say in Scotland is that a bee in my bonnet. It's it's something that's kind of been plaguing my head, yes. And that is it's been something that I've been trying to work with in the sense of trying to because there is a debate in social theory, there is a debate in anthropology that makes very kind of neat distinctions between this is an indigenous person, this is how they think, and this is a non-indigenous person, and this is how they think. They have they have different ontologies, and they will never meet. They will always be contrasting. And one of the things that's very clear from the histories that I explore is that actually things are just not that neat, unfortunately. So as a result of that, of a merging together of class-based interests with cultural interests, ontology is also affected. So ontology, and people can keep ideas in their head which are contradictory and which are multiple at the same time. That you can have, on the one hand, you can, and this is very evident in Bolivia, you can have a very deep respect for Mother Earth, for Pachamama, yeah, and you will carry out a ritual life as well as an individual or as a community in respect of Pachamama. At the same time, you will be a miner. And that you will also be involved perhaps not only in local scale mining, artisanal mining, but actually be involved in state level, large scale mining. So at the same time as you're also placing sticks of dynamite, you will also relate as well to Pachamama. So that these things seem to be in contradiction with each other, but they work. They work for these people in terms of their notion of self, of their own identity. And therefore, it's for that I've kind of tried to play with it, to try and get a grasp on how do they think about the world? How do they think about these moral landscapes and make claims about those moral landscapes in terms of both their protection, but also what they want to get out of that? And these things they're never really seen as being, and I think quite correctly, never seen as being contradictory to each other. You can both respect the land and venerate the natural world, and yet you can also use it. Hope that answers. It'll be enough for now. Okay, Andrei.
Can I chip in exactly on this? Because I had some comments on page 18 in the book. You talk about this idea of indigenous peoples, marginalized peoples, and so on, that at the same time seem to take part actively as protagonists, you say, in state formation, and by taking part in the kind of deal that the state lays out, they consolidate power for a few and reinforce extractivist economic models by doing what you're saying. They actively take part in these models that they, at some level at least, they reject and they despise probably. The question then is, does this mean indigeneity is not a useful analytical concept? Or is it? Or analytical category? Assuming that not all indigenous people contribute equally to this reinforcement. And if yes, if they do contribute, what do we apply? Do we apply class? Do we apply other kinds of concepts to understand this engagement with the state, with a kind of raw deal, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? The state lays out the terms of engagement, and you have a choice. You either don't have any alternatives, you don't engage with the state.
I would claim indigeneity is an important, it's an important conceptualization, but it shouldn't be overly romanticized, and that's what we you know, if you read a lot on this stuff around indigenous identity and indigenous peoples politics, a lot of the literature is very, very romanticized in the sense of saying that they are a people apart. They just don't, there's no, you know, they think about the world entirely differently to us. And it's true that they have very specific eco-philosophies about the world. It is very true that they venerate the world, the natural world, in a very particular way. They don't necessarily also conceptualize themselves as being separate from the natural world. So there is a different way, there is something there that's particular, but it's also an over-romanticization to see that they don't, you know, at the same time that they don't see the world as we do as well. You know, as a result of a history of globalization, of conquest, as a result of a history of capital, they've also been forced to accept as well the need to earn money, to earn a livelihood, just like we do. You know, we actually, you know, we reluctantly take part in this as well. So it's not that they're necessarily that different in that regard, you know. So I mean, so part of the, I guess one of the book parts, or one of the kind of pushes of the book, one of the kind of the directions of the book, is to try and get beyond some of the overly romantic picture of indigenous identity, ontology, thinking about the world, and actually respect them as full human beings, which are full human beings that are challenged by the real condition, the conditions of the world, the complex conditions of the world, where they have a value system on the one hand, but they're also forced at times as well to be pragmatic, and unfortunately also cross lines which they don't want to necessarily cross. A bit like us too, in that way. Okay, let's turn to the audience. If there are any burning questions out there as well, I can take off my glasses now, so I can see you.
How do we do it with the mics?
We're doing good with the time. We've got,
the
microphone. You want to come up? There is.
You just stand up here, maybe?
Is it okay if you use this one? Yeah, or that one. Would you prefer? That one's good. Okay.
I have to choose from my questions to just throw one. All right, so I'm almost done with reading your book. I'm at 85% and I have 2 hours and 15 minutes left because I'm reading the Kindle electronic version, so the app tells me like with precision how far I am right now. And as I'm approaching the end of the book, there's a question that keeps popping in my head, which is John's book sort of an implicit or indirect reivindication, I don't know if that word is correct, or reivindication of the idea of the plurinational state? And I get that question because especially when you talk about Bolivia, I feel there's like an underlying message there, maybe related to this idea of like an optimist view, which I want to share. That the text is telling me in a way like, well, yeah, if only Evo Morales would have complied with the referendum, or if only Correa would have given a different advice to Garcia Linera to approach lithium extraction in a different way, or if maybe Correa would have said, like, you know, you should adopt a strong sustainability approach and be willing to have like limits. Maybe the story would have been different. But yeah, so I don't know if by the time I reach the 100%, I'll get like a specific hint or to clarify that, but that's something I want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, it wasn't written to vindicate those leaders as such. It wasn't meant to sort of to try and sort of tidy up and show them in a better light, but rather to actually show that their projects, their failed projects, are nonetheless an expression of that ongoing history of the expression of resource sovereignty. That there is an expression, another way of looking at the state that is also represented by their political projects, albeit that they actually failed because of they're contradicting themselves, not because of the idea of the plurinational state, but because they contradicted their own idea of the plurinational state.
Because even your selection of the term pluri,
yeah,
it makes me think that you propose in a way that
well,
there's more content to extract from this idea of the pluriverse.
Yeah, that wasn't really the intent at all. I mean, it's important to recognize that the Bolivia, the country of Bolivia, is actually officially called the Plurinational Republic of Bolivia. Yeah? That wasn't my reading of it. It wasn't me trying to put on a term onto the country. They adopted that by a national constitution. Yeah? So there is, this is a constitutionally recognized national title for the country, and they claim themselves as being then the plurinational state. And this was part of the agenda, not only of Morales, but actually the agenda of indigenous groups in the country for at least 40 years. So, I mean, going on from the 1970s onwards, there has been this vision of trying to reformulate the state as a plurinational state, where the nations, that is the indigenous peoples, the indigenous nations, would all have some equal say and respect under the law. And that's what was hoped, that's what they hoped would be delivered under the administration of Evo Morales. Sadly, that hasn't quite transpired.
Can I? No, I'll leave it there.
We can come back to this one.
Yeah.
We'll talk more next week as well. Yeah. Any other questions? Mariel, what?
Yeah, I have a question, or maybe an observation. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. And this is that it strikes me when you read the second part, or just the second part that you read. I'm surprised, but and this is not only you, but I think other writers and other people, analysts, are surprised or seem to be surprised that so-called renewable resources that are going to be used for the green transformation or the green transition that are not fossil fuels, but like lithium and others that are going to be used for more sustainable ways of producing energy, that they cause the same conflicts and contestations. And to me, it's like it's a question of does it depend on what type of resources we're talking about, or again, is the institutions that govern the extraction or that try to regulate the extraction? Because to me, it should not be surprising. I mean, it's maybe different, lithium from oil, but the intention and what is being done is more or less the same.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, on that note, I mean, we can talk about this endlessly, but I mean, it's yet another inconvenient truth for us in terms of facing up to climate change, right? It's one of the things that we all have to get with the picture and understand is that that all of these technologies for renewable development, for renewable energy production, for the green transition, all of them are going to rely on extracted resources, extracted minerals and extracted metals. All of that has to be, that's part of it. So when I say that, that doesn't mean that I'm opposed to a shift to renewable energy production, but I think that we have to get real about what that really will entail. I mean, you know, it's important to understand that, you know, with battery technologies, the new battery technologies that we have that will be used for electric vehicles and for all of the technologies that we have in our green future, all of them can be made with different metals, but the one thing that they can't do without is lithium. The one mineral that they're going to have to use in order to make them effective in terms of their energy storage and output is lithium. And actually, lithium is only available in actually very restricted amounts around the world. There are very few places in the world where you can actually find lithium. And actually, this area of the world in the high Andes is the place where most of the reserve can be found. There are reserves elsewhere. I have a PhD student who's been working on there are some efforts to try and develop the industrialization of lithium in Zimbabwe. There's an effort in Portugal, an effort in Finland. But there are actually very, very few places in the United States as well. So there are very few places in the world, and that means that these places will have to incur the costs of our shift to the renewable technologies, right? There's going to be, we have to accept that if that's part of it. But that's really difficult to accept because of the impacts that it will have on the natural world and also the impacts it will have on those local populations. So then the question that we have to ask, then how do we make, you know, that more just? How do we make that more acceptable? So that has to also be addressed. And we also have to think about what it will entail as well here in Norway. I mean, the leader for Bellona was talking on the news the other day. He's heavily invested in this himself, and so we can ask a lot of questions about what his real interests are. But one of the things that his argument was correct in is that all of this, if we want to make a shift over to renewable energy development, all of it will mean a cost for also our landscape, not only the landscapes or the land elsewhere in the world, but a cost as well on our territory, on our land as well. Because you can't, you know, even if you build them offshore, there will be enormous consequences for also marine life. And if you build them onshore, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of masts all over this landscape. And so, you know, there will be a consequence. And so a lot of that we have to really get, you know, we have to wise up and realize that that's the real picture and that we need to think about how do we deal with that sufficiently? How do we do that in a way which is just for nature and just for the local population? Or, and there is another alternative, or we have to think about not producing so much energy and living with less energy, which is the other way we can go. Any other questions? Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Well, I have to say that I haven't read the book, so this comes from curiosity. Okay, perfect. So, so you were talking about this plural component of state especially in Latin America. So you talk about how the government, the illegal organizations, and multinational companies kind of like have different territories under their control or different dimensions of power. And now I'm talking about my own country, Colombia, and what I feel is that, yes, it's plural, but at the end it's also concentrated. When you look at the government and the illegal organizations and the multinational companies, they're usually connected, and usually there's like the same people behind there. So I was wondering what you think about, like, is this like, how do you deal with this concept of plural? Because of course there are like social movements, you were talking about like feminist causes, but when we are talking about like basic rights, like energy, like environment, I don't feel that I feel a lot of frustration because it's like we're dealing with the same people. even if it's like they identify as the government or as Águilas Negras or they're, yeah. So that's, is that a question?
That is a question. So I think that it's important to make a distinction between the fact that power in Colombia is very concentrated. So power, like, real, political power, also the power of, or real, genuine, military force is certainly concentrated. But sovereignty isn't. And so actually what I'm playing in with the book is that sovereignty actually, despite the efforts by the powerful to control our notion of sovereignty or the state, the fact is that it's always contested from below. It's contested from below, and that sovereignty isn't something that only a few of the powerful can claim, because they never actually managed to actually fully establish that. There will always be contestations against their claims. And actually, Colombian history is actually a very good example of that, in the way in which power, even amongst the elites, has been also been terribly territorialized, right? It's really spread in the country in different ways. And has always been contested. And civil society in Colombia is extraordinary and a great inspiration to me, actually, as well, in the sense of the fact that they do make claims on the state. They make claims on sovereignty, which are very much counter to those forces of power, which very much, places the backs of those powerful very often up against the wall as well. I mean, you've gone through, it's a horrific history, but you've gone through 55 years of war, of civil war. If that wasn't an example of the contested nature of sovereignty, I don't know what is, right? I mean, okay, it didn't work out. It didn't work out in the interests of those that, that started that war. But it didn't end up necessarily in the interest of those that were the powerful elites either. I mean, that's also, the elites clearly, they can get away with waging a war, and they can live in conditions, live in the lap of luxury in the middle of a war, but they also live in utter fear behind big walls with glass, with broken glass on the top, or behind razor wire. I mean, okay, is that, great, you're living in luxury, but this is kind of like a horrible life too. You're living in, so who won from that war? It's very hard to say, actually, who won from that war at all. But one of the things we can actually absolutely say is that it was a war about land and resources and sovereignty.
I go back to you.
Great. Mike. Come on.
I know we're running out of time. I want to say I agree that it's enlightening, shocking, scary, inspiring. So it's really great to hear this work. My question is about how much of a historical argument you want to make here. And I come from different disciplines, so this could be related to the concept of sovereignty. So when I hear sovereignty, I think of biopolitics, I think about Derrida's work on the beast and the sovereign, and so you could use the language. So I'm curious if you engage with, Foucault, for example, whether you do or not. I mean, you could use that vocabulary to talk about, if I heard correctly at the beginning, that it seems that there's something new here, right? The level of violence, this is not a phenomenon. The visibility, the names of people who can make these claims are being met with brute force, right? So it's not a kind of internalization that's kind of working its way out. But I'm wondering how much you see this as a fundamentally new thing that's happening, or is this the way that it's been all along? This is just giving us more insight into these longer kind of phenomena.
Yeah, good question. So I think that the violence has new expression, but it is also at the same time also a continuance of a history, of a long history. And very much kind of, I guess one of the kind of fundamental underlying arguments of the book as well is that what we see in terms of this violence is very much kind of the original sin of a settler society. I mean, the very what we're seeing in Latin America is the remaining traces of conquest and all that went with it. The horrific racism, history of slavery, the history of abuse of the indigenous population, all of that being continued as well from one period to the next. So there are certainly long pathways, long shadows here that have to be recognised. But I do think as well that there are new features to that violence, and that has to do with as well the way in which states have been updated in terms of their institutional structures. There's new languages that get introduced, like rights, which get used and abused at the same time. There's languages as well of sustainability and green transition and all of that, which also similarly get used and abused over time. So there are many kind of new features that people have to. There are many new features that people have to reckon with and find a way to deal with as well in their, by testing multiple doorways, multiple strategies in order to basically just find a way to live in peace, very often, at least at the level of these local communities. That's the case. So it's I hope that the book describes sufficiently those new features, but also recognizing as well those kind of long shadows that are there as well. I have to be, those of you who know me know that actually I started out life as a prehistoric archaeologist, and so I see history in the longue durée. I see it as something that happens over a long sweep. It's not just something that we can look at in terms of, let's look at the last 2 decades and figure it out. That's not enough. So, and it's not enough in Latin America, it's not enough anywhere else either. So there are these long shadows that get passed down over time that have to also be acknowledged as well. I think that we're out of time. So what I need to do now is first of all say thank you to my 3 guests, to my 3 colleagues here, Mariel, Bjørn and Andrei. Thank you very much for taking part in this discussion. It's been wonderful to have you with me this evening. I'm sure that we'll have further conversation, perhaps with a beer after this, perhaps at another occasion, who knows, whatever. But I would certainly wish that we could all perhaps give them a round of applause, first of all. I also want to thank all of you for coming along, and for those who are joining streaming, please, again, I'm very thankful that you've taken time to bother with us and time to watch us and listen to us. So thanks to all of you, and have a good evening. Read my book if you want. Try and find a cheap copy of it. It's disastrously pricey downstairs, but anyway, it's available should you wish it, and it's on Kindle, I believe, as well. Yes, there you go.
And thank you, John.
Thank you, John.